Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another of our Discover Wildlife evenings tonight. My name is Ian Lloyd. I'm one of the products managers here at Wildlife Worldwide, and I'm delighted to be joined by Nick Garbutt this evening for our Discover Madagascar talk.
Good evening, everyone.
I'm sure many of you will know Nick already, but for anyone that doesn't, Nick is one of our most popular tour leaders, an incredibly talented photographer, an author, naturalist, and a world authority on all things Madagascar. So we're in for a treat tonight. I've been lucky enough to visit Madagascar myself on a few occasions, and for me, it really is the most magical and breathtaking wildlife experience on the planet. It's just so unique as a destination. Just wanted to let you all know that we will have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the talk this evening on the chat function and the Q&A. There's another box. If you'd like to ask questions at any time, please write them down, and we will also go through some with Nick at the end of the talk. At the end of the talk, we'll also have a poll, which will give you the opportunity to request a travel plan for Madagascar, which will give some more details on some of our trips there. So if you're ready, Nick, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Good evening, everyone, once again. Delighted to be with you to talk about a place very, very close to my heart indeed. I've been fascinated by Madagascar since childhood. Long before I ever had a chance to visit, remember reading about and investigating what information there was to do with lemurs and indris, sifakas, elephant birds, etc. So when I got the chance to go for the first time in 1991, this is me, fresh-faced young lad, in 91, on my first visit to Madagascar, I felt like I'd been let loose in a candy store. I travelled to the island for a month. I had 200 quid in my pocket in cash to see me through that month. I'd spent £100 on film, remember that stuff? And I'd managed to travel around on local bush taxis, visit 4 national parks, take photographs, managed to sell 2 magazine articles on the back of that. And I thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. So I've been in love with Madagascar for a very, very long time. So I hope I can share some of that passion with you this evening and introduce you to, as Ian has alluded to, one of the most extraordinary wildlife destinations there is in the world. The fact that Madagascar is so unlike anywhere else. I think it's the fact that sets it apart. It's a cliche almost, otherworldly. The habitats that you're able to visit, the variety of habitats are just different in so many ways to anything else you're likely to see in other parts of the world. You really can regard Madagascar as a continent in its own right. It's the world's oldest island, and I'll come back to that shortly. And because it's been isolated for so long, so many of the species that have evolved there are completely different to anything elsewhere. And virtually everything that's found there is found nowhere else. It's all endemic, which obviously just sets it apart. Take the reptiles, for instance. 97% of all of the reptiles, of which there are 450 odd species known, 97% of them are found nowhere else on the planet. There are 60% of all the world's chameleons, which probably evolved in Madagascar. This is a Parsons chameleon, one of the largest species. I'll come back to this later. Amphibians too are almost 100% endemic. There are 2 non-endemic species out of over 360. So just an extraordinary level of diversity and endemism in a relatively small island. Yes, it's a big island, but when you compare it to a continental landmass like Africa next door, it's very small, and yet there's so much packed within it that's found nowhere else. Birds, of course, high levels of speciality here. There are 210 different species of breeding bird, about 300 different species have been recorded on the island, just over 200, 210 that breed there, and more than half of those are found nowhere else. There are several families that are endemic. This is one of the endemic families, the Acetes, of which there are 4 species. Shows wonderful convergent evolution. This is a common sunbird, Acete, wonderful example of convergent evolution with true sunbirds. There are only 2 species of true sunbird on Madagascar, and there are 2 species of sunbird Acete that mimic them or are parallels in an evolutionary sense. The mammals, which are probably my first love in the group that I've specialized in, are equally remarkable. If you take out the bats, which obviously can fly and therefore cross water more easily, 100% of the native mammals are endemic to the island. They're found nowhere else. And even if you take bats into consideration, 85% of all of the bats are endemic as well. So it's just phenomenal levels. This is one of the unusual carnivores. It's called a boki. Of course, the lemurs are the most famous of Madagascar's mammals, a group of primates that became isolated on the island a long time ago, probably 50 to 60 million years ago, and have just evolved into an extraordinary diversity. Over 100 species of lemur are now known. What's remarkable about the mammals, if you take them as a whole, is there are 4, take out the bats, there are 4 land-based terrestrial mammal groups on Madagascar. Lemurs, obviously the primates, the carnivores that we've alluded to, there are rodents, and there are tenrecs, which are insectivore-like mammals. And each of those groups is derived from a single common ancestor that colonized the island in the dim and distant past, almost certainly by rafting across from mainland Africa. And I'll come back to that shortly. So lemurs, of course, are the flagship animals that Madagascar has, ring-tailed lemurs being the most famous, of course, but there's a huge diversity. Larger species like this gorgeous diadem sifaka, and then really peculiar rarities like the ii, which when it was first discovered was thought to be a rodent, not a primate at all. And it's so peculiar. It belongs to an order, a zoological order all on its own. So as a place, Madagascar really is an Aladdin's cave of discovery, opportunity, and a place just like unlike anywhere else. There's just nowhere that's comparable. And the fact that the island has so much that is so different is rooted in its history and its biogeographical history, early beginnings. So if you wind the clock back anywhere between 300 and 500 million years, the great landmass of the southern part of the globe, Gondwana, almost certainly was all joined together somewhat like this, and they all these little pieces fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, as you can see. And then gradually, through the movement of tectonic plates, these land masses all started to drift apart. Now that obviously took millions and millions of years, and you can see from this very approximate graphic a potential timeline over which this happened, with Gondwana breaking up from some point over 200 million years ago and gradually fragmenting through the ages, to the point that Madagascar probably broke away from the great landmass that later became Africa, South America, probably broke away around 120 million years ago, albeit with what is now India still attached. And then India broke away from Madagascar around 90 million years ago, give or take. And India then drifted north and eventually hit the Eurasian landmass 40 odd million years ago, formed the Himalayas, etc. So Madagascar has been there or thereabouts in its current position and isolated for over 80 million years. Now, of course, that's before present day mammals evolved, modern mammals evolved. We know that when the dinosaurs became extinct 60 odd million years ago, probably due to asteroid impact, virtually everything was wiped out on the planet. There were just small pockets of things that survived, including some very early mammals, but those were the forebears of what we see on Madagascar, but there were none that remained on Madagascar. So we can be pretty certain that all the mammals that arrived on Madagascar had to cross water, probably from Africa, to get to Madagascar. And we think that only happened 4 times. And obviously it had to be a pregnant female or a pair of animals that floated on vegetation. And we see this today with seeds that float around the tropics and the various oceans and get washed up and then germinate. And we also see it today with great mats of vegetation, some of which would harbor marooned animals, small animals, and almost certainly the small precursors of the mammals that we see on Madagascar today were marooned on some mats of vegetation that got washed out in a great storm, whatever it may be, from the African mainland, and gradually over a period of time, probably several weeks, drifted across and washed up on Madagascar, and then those animals then proliferated and evolved to what we see today. So a phenomenal sequence of events, but one that happened so rarely. So really was a lottery in terms of what arrived on Madagascar and then subsequently developed. Today, we see the results of just a huge level of different habitat diversity, the evolution of species into a huge array of habitat diversity, which I'm going to break down roughly into 3 main areas. There are lots of subtle variation within these, but for the purposes of this evening, we'll just break it down into 3 main areas. Eastern rainforest, over on the eastern side, shown in green on this map. Down in the south and the southwest, the areas shown in orange are the southern dry, arid, spiny forests. And then the areas shown in red and the west and the north are the dry deciduous forests. And the reason for this level of habitat diversity is twofold. Obviously, there's a north-south, a considerable north-south distance, 1,600 kilometers north to south is Madagascar. And there's an east-west rain shadow as well. Most of the weather comes from the eastern side. There's a mountain range running down the center. So, of course, most of the weather coming from the eastern side is moist, coming across the Indian Ocean. That moist air is forced to rise when it reaches the mountains on the eastern side, and therefore deposits lots and lots of rain. So the eastern side of the island is very wet. And then, of course, once you go further west to the western side of the island, it's largely in a rain shadow, so it's so much drier. In addition to that, there's a monsoon gradient that runs north to south. So the monsoon brings more rain to the northern parts of the island and the southern parts. Effectively, those 2 things in combination mean that the northeastern corner of the island is the wettest and the southwestern portion of the island is the driest. And that, in combination with the topography, leads to this development of such a massive array of different and peculiar habitat types. So I'm going to start in the south and the southwest. Spiny forest or spiny thicket, dominated in parts by a family of trees that are found nowhere else in the world. They're called the Didieraceae or octopus trees. Superficially might resemble cacti, but they're a woody tree. They're not a succulent. And in areas where they're very dense, they look like this. This is obviously after rain and they're green, but a lot of the time they're brown, covered in vicious spines, hence the name spiny forest, of course. Lots of succulents too. This is one of the giant pachypodiums in the southwest. And of course, it's an area that's renowned for baobabs. There are 8 species of baobab in the world, 1 on Africa, 1 in Australia. The other 6 are only found in Madagascar. And 3 of those are found especially down in the south and southwest where it's particularly dry. This is one of the really remarkable species and remarkable individual tree. This is called, it's sometimes called the red-barked baobab, Adansonia rubus striper. And this particular tree, which is in a park down in the southwest called Simanampasuts, it's thought this particular individual tree is something in the region of 3,800 years old. These dry areas, of course, have a wonderful diversity of species. Reptiles are particularly prevalent because it's dry and arid, so they thrive. Chameleons, as I've alluded to, are a real Madagascar specialty, and there are lots of different species that are only found down in this arid part of the island. This is the warty or spiny-backed chameleon, one of the larger species. Other reptiles that you might encounter down in these areas, one of the species of boa. There's only 4 species of boa in Madagascar, which are distantly related to boas in South America. This is one of the rarer ones. It's called Dumeril's boa. Birds too. I've mentioned that so many are endemic. This is one of the real highlights of any visit down to the southwest, an area of spiny forest in the extreme southwest. This is called a long-tailed ground roller, which belongs to the endemic family, the ground rollers, of which there are just 5 species, 1 in the spiny forest and 4 in the rainforest that I'll get to later. And this particular species, the long-tailed ground roller, is only found in a narrow strip of spiny forest down in the southwest. One of the renowned birding localities on the island, a location called Ifati, is where this photo was taken, and many birdwatching trips visit Ifati to see this bird and several others that are local to that particular region. Another bird renowned to be seen down in the south is the giant kua. Belongs to a family that's a subfamily that's endemic, the kua family, Kuinae, which are related to the cuckoos. This is the largest of the kuas, about the size of a pheasant. Many of them are ground dwelling, like this one. Others that I'll show you later are arboreal and live a little like turacos do in Africa. Perhaps the most celebrated bird family on Madagascar are the vangas, which have evolved into an enormous variety of body shapes and particularly beak forms that exploit all manner of niches. And when I first visited Madagascar, there were probably something in the region of 14 or 15 species of vanga that are known. Today, because of various techniques that are being used to really delve into evolutionary history, we now know 23 different bird species belong to this family. Virtually all of them are found nowhere else in Madagascar. One species has managed to also colonize nearby Comoro Islands, the blue vanga. But such is their variety in size and particularly beak shape that I'm fairly certain had Charles Darwin visited Madagascar instead of the Galapagos Islands, his thoughts on evolution would have been provoked in much the same way as they were when he looked at the finches that bear his name. So just an amazing example of adaptive radiation from a single ancestor. Parrots on Madagascar are very peculiar. In most other parts of the world, we tend to think parrots are gaudy, bright-coloured birds, many of which pair for life. On Madagascar, there are only 3 species of parrots. 2 are vasa parrots. This is the greater vasa parrot, most peculiar. They don't pair for life. They're obviously not gaudy and brightly coloured. They're very dull. They're black. And they're very promiscuous. They're not monogamous. So during the breeding season, the female will mate with multiple males, and she advertises her readiness to mate by sitting outside a tree hole and making lots of noise. And she loses all the feathers on her head, and her head goes bright yellow like this. So very different behavior to parrots in other parts of the world. Of course, this area is most famous for ring-tailed lemurs, perhaps the most famous inhabitant of Madagascar, certainly the most famous lemur. But ironically, rather atypical as lemurs are concerned, because it's largely terrestrial. Most lemurs are tree dwelling, they're arboreal. Ring-tailed lemurs spend a quarter to a third of their time actually on the ground, not in the trees, and do a lot of foraging on the ground. So they're not particularly typical. And despite their popularity and the fact that they're so well known, they're now becoming increasingly rare because of habitat fragmentation and other factors that I'll come back to later. But of course, they do spend time up in the trees, and they're able to climb around in the amazing spiny forest and avoid being skewered by the spines. All lemur's feet are very soft, like almost like leathery velvet, and they're able to maneuver their way around these branches without getting spiked. Very, very agile, and leap between these trees and branches, as well as run around on the ground, foraging for fruit, leaves, all manner of things. So not typical as far as lemurs are concerned. And even on the ground, in one particular park, this is back in Simon-en-Pursuit, which is a limestone plateau with lots of underground caves, typical of limestone areas. Water, of course, is at a premium, and the ringtails in Simon-en-Pursuit have learnt to descend into the underground caves to drink. Other lemurs that you would expect to see down in spiny forest areas in the south and southwest would be Verosiphaca, one of the most beautiful lemurs, all white with a lovely chocolate-coloured cap. And these animals are so well adapted to the extreme aridity of the island. They actually don't need to drink. They get all of their moisture from the vegetation that they eat. So they obviously have incredibly efficient kidneys that are able to extract virtually all of the moisture from the leaves that they eat. They're very agile when feeding in the trees. This sort of behavior, suspensory behavior, is very, very common. And also they're famous for crossing open areas with this rather comical skip-like bounce, bounding across open areas. All siphacas are able to do this. Verosiphaca is the one that's most renowned, probably because the habitat that it lives in is more open, and because of habitat fragmentation, there are more open areas that it has to cross. But even siphacas in the rainforest are capable of this mode of locomotion if forced. It just doesn't happen very often. So it tends to be something associated with Verosiphaca more than any other Siphaca variety. This is Lake Simon-en-Pursuit that I alluded to or mentioned. It's the only major saline lake on the island, large saline lake with a limestone plateau on its eastern flanks. It's the only lake on Madagascar where greater flamingos breed, for instance. So they do fly across from the African mainland, and there are small populations, or relatively small populations, that breed on Lake Simon-en-Pursuit. But it's the vegetation that grows on the eastern side on the limestone escarpment that is really spectacular and peculiar. And at night, all sorts of really weird and wacky things are possible to see. Throughout the dry parts of the island, this species of tenrec, the lesser hedgehog tenrec, is something that you would hope to encounter on a night walk. I mentioned that tenrecs are a group that are related, similar to insectivores, although they're a distant offshoot, and all of the 30-odd species that are found in Madagascar are, as I mentioned earlier, endemic. This is obviously a good example of convergent evolution with true hedgehogs, but unlike true hedgehogs, they're actually quite agile and able to climb up around branches, feed on insects and invertebrates, but surprisingly nimble for an animal that looks a little clumsy at times. One of the other species that is really sought after if you were visiting Simon-en-Pursuit and would become visible at night is one of the endemic carnivores. This is Grondidier's vontsera. Now, it used to be called Grondidier's mongoose, but we now know that it's not at all a mongoose, very distantly related. All of the carnivores on Madagascar belong to an endemic family, because going back to what I mentioned earlier, They're all derived from a single ancestor that colonized the island, perhaps 35 million years ago, something like that. And there are 8 species, just 8 endemic carnivores on Madagascar, but Grondidier's Vontsira is only known from the limestone areas to the east of Lake Simenampasuts. But if you camp at Lake Simenampasuts, you have a very good chance of seeing this animal. A little further inland, but still down in the central portion of the southern part of the island, is another huge rocky outcrop area, not limestone this time, but sandstone, eroded into this spectacular formations, a bit Grand Canyon-like in some ways. This is Isalu National Park, which is actually one of the most visited national parks on the island, mainly for people doing day treks in and so forth. It's not the most wildlife-rich location, certainly when compared to other parks in the island, but nonetheless is spectacular visually and intriguing and interesting for many reasons. The vegetation is most peculiar, and there are lots of locally endemic species. This is one of them, a type of Pachypodium, obviously a type of water retention succulent type species. And even in these dry habitats, there are amphibians. This is one of the burrowing frogs. It belongs to a genus called Scaphria freeni. This is the painted burrowing frog that's endemic to the Isalu area, and it spends probably 8 or 9 months of the year buried underground, and then only emerges during the brief rainy season from sort of December through till the end of March. This is also an area where ring-tailed lemurs still survive. It's one of the few strongholds left for ring-tailed lemurs. Not typical habitat, but ringtails, unlike many other lemur species, have a very broad habitat tolerance, not just down in spiny forest, but lots of other dry, arid areas, and even further east, right up to the border of rainforest areas, they're known to occur. Close to Isalu and further east in the highlands, near a national park called Andringritra, there are populations of ringtails. And these are worth a mention because in and around this high mountain area, some populations of ringtails live at really high altitudes and often are found or can be found above 2,000 meters in elevation. Of course, when it gets really, really cold, there are frosts at times at night at elevations, at those elevations. So the ringtails in these areas have developed much thicker coats than ringtails that live in the hot, arid south. And if you were to visit a reserve called Anja, which is relatively easily reached off one of the main roads, Route National 7, heading south through Madagascar, you can actually see populations of ringtails that live on the rocks in a similar way to those at higher elevations and higher altitudes. And their fur really is so much more luxuriant. So that's given you an overview of the south and southwestern portion of the island. I'm now going to move on to the areas shown in dark red, burgundy color, the west and north of the island where deciduous forest grows. So again, we're in the rain shadow, but there's a little more rain falls and over a slightly longer period. So the forest changes quite considerably and isn't dominated by the Didieraceae, but is more typical of a deciduous forest. It's not a deciduous forest where all the leaves are shed at one go, like deciduous forests in temperate regions. There's no point during the annual cycle where all the leaves have disappeared. So even in the dry season, perhaps 70% of leaves are shed, but there are still 30% of the leaves there. But in the wet season, all of the foliage is there. So in some of the remote northwestern areas, there's wonderful patches of forest where there are baobabs growing all the way down to the shoreline, to the coast, interspersed with dry deciduous forest. And sadly, these areas are very, very restricted now, but this kind of gives you a window back in time as to what an awful lot of the western coast of Madagascar perhaps once looked like. And if you wind the clock back 30, 40, 50 million years, when those early colonizing mammals would have arrived on Madagascar, they could have washed up on a beach that looked something like this, and then started that great evolutionary journey that led to what we see today. This is one of the areas where the baobabs really dominate. This is arguably the most spectacular of Madagascar's baobabs. It's called Grandidier's baobab, the largest. Colossal trees. This is a very famous area in central western Madagascar, north of the town of Morondave. It's called the Avenue of Baobabs, Baobab Alley. Now, this photograph was taken on one of my early visits in the mid-90s, taken on film. Sadly, the Baobab Alley doesn't quite look like this anymore because two of these trees have now fallen down because they became so old. But nonetheless, there is still this wonderful avenue, which is a happy accident. There are lots of baobabs either side of this, and it just so happens that there's a line through which a track, which was obviously an original cart track, and it's now a road, not a paved road, but a dirt road, passes through, and it just gives the illusion of an avenue like this. But it's one of the most famous and most photographed places in Madagascar, and is now a World Heritage Site. So some of the other reptiles that you'd expect to encounter in these dry deciduous forests, one of the groups of geckos for which Madagascar is most famous, the day geckos, the genus Phelsuma. This is the largest of them, the giant day gecko, common in many of the dry deciduous forests. Another one of the boas, this is the Madagascar ground boa, beautiful example of wonderful forest floor camouflage here. But this is a species that you might get lucky and encounter in some of the western reserves, famous reserves like Karindi or Ankarafansk, for instance. Birds too, lots of endemic birds in these western forests. This is one of the most endangered of all, the Madagascar fish eagle, one of the world's rarest birds of prey. There are probably fewer than 60, 65 pairs of Madagascar fish eagle left. But in one or two places like Singi de Bemaraha National Park or Ankarafansk or Anjajavi, for instance, you can actually see them with relative ease because the various pairs have nests and they're quite visible. But nonetheless, it's easy to overlook the fact that you're looking at one of the world's rarest birds. Obviously, quite a close relative, same genus as the African fish eagle, same genus indeed, Haliaeetus, as our domestic or native white-tailed sea eagle, but obviously a little different. Back to the vangas I mentioned, there are now 23 different species. This is one that's endemic to Western forest, the Western rufous vanga, shrike-like bird, another variation on that vanga theme. And rodents, I've yet to mention Madagascar's rodents, again, all endemic, derived from a single colonizing ancestor, and vary in size from very small, like this Western forest mouse, which is largely terrestrial, right up to the largest rodent on the island, very rare, critically endangered giant jumping rat, which is the size of a small rabbit, and is only found in a very, very small area, the area around Mena Bay, north of Morondave, in the central western portion of Madagascar. But now very, very restricted, only found on sandy soils, lives in monogamous pairs, digs burrows and mates for life, will only find a new partner if one of the pair dies or is predated. So a most unusual rodent, but Karindi is the place that is really the only place that you can visit where you have a realistic chance of seeing this nocturnal creature. Lots of lemurs too on these western deciduous forests. This is one of the more readily encountered, the brown lemur. Siphakas too in the northwest, this beautiful species, Cockerel sifaka, readily seen at Ankarafansk or at Anjajavi, for instance. And some of the nocturnal species are particularly interesting. This is one of the dwarf lemurs, a group belong to the genus Chirogalius, and they're the only group of primates in the world that are obligate hibernators. They have to hibernate at some point during the annual cycle. Different species hibernate for different lengths of time, anywhere between about 5 months of hibernation to as long as 7 or 8 months of hibernation in some extreme environments. And they're primarily hibernating to avoid dry season in the west, but there are some in very high elevation montane forests that I'll come back to later that are primarily hibernating not only to avoid the dry season, but also avoid the extreme cold. So during that hibernation period, they survive on the fat deposits that they've laid down during the wet season when they gorge themselves. And an awful lot of that fat is stored in the tail. So this is a fat-tailed dwarf lemur. And after the wet season, when they've gorged themselves, that tail that you see there would be about twice the size that it is in this photograph, really fat and bulbous. And over the course of the dry season, when they're dormant and hibernating, they will lose up to 25% of their body weight, most of which comes from that tail. Another species that is very restricted, only found in the Mena Bay area in the central western part of the island. This is Madame Berth's mouse lemur, which has the distinction of being the world's smallest primate, weighs 25 to 30 grams and would easily sit in your cupped hand. Some of the unusual carnivores that are found in western forests, this again is a species that's only found in central, western and southwestern areas. It's called the boki. Used to be called a narrow-striped mongoose, but as I mentioned earlier, we now know that the Malagasy carnivores are not at all in a close sense related to mongooses. They're a completely separate evolutionary offshoot belonging to a family called the Eupleridae. Boki are unusual in that they live in same-sex groups for most of the year. So females live together and then males live together in groups, and they only actually come together to find mating pairs during the mating season. Perhaps the most famous of Madagascar's carnivores is its largest carnivore, the fossa. Anyone familiar with the Madagascar cartoon will know the characters in the cartoon that the lemurs were most scared of was the fossa, the island's top carnivore. A big male can weigh 10 or 11 kilos and wonderfully agile hunter, both on the ground and in the canopy. This is a male, fantastically muscular, as you can see, with a long tail that's not prehensile, but is obviously a counterbalance. So in terms of sort of general size, a male like this, a fully grown male, would be about 90 centimeters from its bum to its nose tip, and then tail a similar length, 90 centimeters, and roughly about 25, 30 centimeters at the shoulder. So not huge, but powerful and stocky and wonderful climbers. Somewhat similar to squirrels, they have reversible ankles. So when they descend tree trunks, are able to grip with their feet and hold their hind legs behind themselves like this. And as I mentioned, wonderfully agile climbers, so they can hunt lemurs in the canopy. They also mate in the canopy and have a most peculiar mating system. When a female comes into estrus, it's only for about 7 to 10 days per year, generally at the end of October, early November, and she advertises her reproductive state by sitting up in a favorite tree. She returns to the same tree year on year, releases lots of pheromones, which males pick up from miles away, and then lots of males come to mate with a single female. So over the course of the week or so that she's in estrus, she can mate with multiple males, 5, 6, 7 matings, a noisy affair. A single copulation can last several hours. And because obviously a single female mates with lots of males, the males don't know actually if they're successful in mating or not, whether they're going to father the offspring. which has led in an evolutionary sense to extreme sperm competition. So male fossa have developed very long willies and huge, they produce a huge amount of semen. So they produce copious quantities of semen when they inseminate the female, and it's all part of this cycle of extreme sperm competition. They have to produce this to just give themselves a chance of inseminating the female successfully, because they know she will have mated with umpteen other males as well. Interspersed amongst some of this western forest are limestone rocky outcrops that have been eroded into spectacular pinnacle formations known in Madagascar as singi. One of these is up in the far north, a national park called Ankarana. And within these limestone, or around these limestone rocky outcrops, there's various patches of deciduous forest which harbour all manner of species. So these are spectacular places in Ankarana to see, for instance, crowned lemurs. This is a male crowned lemur, and as you can see, they're nimble and agile enough to bound around on these razor-sharp rocks to move between patches of forest, and where underground streams and rivers have carved out caves. Some of these caves and caverns collapse to form caves. So Ankarana and some of the other limestone areas are renowned as some of the most extensive cave systems in Madagascar, which means they are extremely rich in bats, which of course is the one group of mammals I haven't really touched on yet. There are somewhere in the region of 45 different bat species in Madagascar. Again, 85% of them are endemic, but unlike the other four main groups of mammals, which almost certainly came across historically from the African mainland, some of the bats in Madagascar show origins to Asian species. So undoubtedly their ancestors would have been blown across from Asian land masses at some point in the distant past. And there are probably known to have been over 25 different colonizing events, bat colonizing events in Madagascar, some from the African mainland, some from the Asian mainland, or Southeast Asian and Asian areas. This is Comus's leaf-nosed bat, one of the more readily seen species. Also seen, alluding to Southeast Asian evolutionary history, are flying foxes. The Madagascar flying fox has many close relatives on other Indian Ocean islands and across into India and across into Southeast Asia, the genus Pteropus, which are the classic flying foxes. So this is the endemic Madagascar flying fox. One of the other fruit bat species that has its affinities in Africa is the straw-coloured fruit bat, and there's a very close relation to the Madagascar straw-coloured fruit bat on the African mainland. Some of you are probably aware that if you visited Kasanka National Park in Zambia, has some of the largest bat aggregations, mammal aggregations on the planet, where 10+ million African straw-coloured fruit bats gather. And on Madagascar, there's a very close relative that is often seen in some of the caves in Ankarana, for instance, as you see here. Not that far away from Ankarana, again up in the north, is another fascinating area around the small town of Darena, and this is a little village called Andranosimati, close to Darena. This is really an amalgamation of western deciduous forest with elements of the eastern rainforest. So it's a sort of slightly more humid forest that's grown in this very peculiar enclave up in the far, far north of the island. And because the habitat here is a little peculiar and different to elsewhere, it's just home to yet another little array of species that are found in such a tight corner of the island and nowhere else. What makes Darena so peculiar is that it really encapsulates so many of the environmental woes and difficulties that Madagascar faces, which I'm going to come back to. But it's an incredibly poor area, as is most of Madagascar, of course. And the local people eke out a living precariously by digging these horrific deep shafts to excavate and pan for gold. And it's an awful existence, really, and they're panning for just scraps of gold. You know, this might be the return from an entire week or whatever it is, but it allows them to survive. But of course, the forest is really badly affected as a consequence of all of the mining activity. And yet, despite these people being so poor, they have a wonderful relationship with the lemurs that they regard as sacred, so they're never hunted. So you get this wonderfully charming juxtaposition of very poor people eking out a living digging for gold, living alongside this particular animal, the golden-crowned sifaka, which is one of the rarest primates in the world. And if you were to visit these forests, you're always guaranteed to see these sifakas on a regular basis each day. But this is the only place you can see them. And it's just a sort of window into all that makes Madagascar so special, but all that makes it such an environmental conundrum and such a difficult place to balance the needs of people and wildlife. But obviously, if you do visit this area, seeing these sifakas and seeing them really close is one of the most magical experiences. There are at night also, there is the chance to see several other nocturnal species of lemur, mouse lemurs, dwarf lemurs, etc., but also potentially the chance to see arguably the most peculiar of all lemurs, if not one of the most peculiar mammals on the planet. The animal responsible for excavating all of these holes in this bit of rotting trunk is, of course, the eye, which builds nests. So during the day, it would be sleeping in a cluster of twigs and leaves like this, and then at dusk, it would emerge. And in Darena, you have a realistic chance. Not easy to see, but if you go to Darena for 2 or 3 nights, you would have a realistic chance of tracking down an eye. The best way to do so is to find a nest during the day and basically just stake it out at dusk until the animal emerges. You can get fooled because, of course, some nests aren't used every night, so you can sit outside a nest that's empty. But with the help of local guides, your chances of success are pretty good. So on the trips that I do to Madagascar, which the itineraries often incorporate visits to Darena, obviously trying to track down eyes where all of these photographs were taken is one of our priorities. They really are the most peculiar animal. They feed primarily on insects. They're effectively an insectivorous primate, feeding on insect grubs, and they use these huge ears to listen for beetle grubs that are buried in rotting wood, listen for them moving around. Once they've pinpointed those beetle grub, they will use their rodent-like incisors, which grow throughout their lives, just like a rodent, to chisel into the rotting wood, to rip it out and hence excavate the holes that you saw in that piece of rotting tree bark, tree trunk that I showed earlier. And then once they've excavated the hole, or they will then use this extraordinary middle finger that you can see in this photograph, which is nothing more than bone covered in skin and has a ball and socket joint that allows it to rotate through 360 degrees. They will then use that to poke into the hole, maneuver it around, skewer the insect grub and winkle it out. A method of feeding that no other primate is able to achieve. Somewhat, in some ways, not dissimilar to the way, say, a woodpecker might feed, but obviously a primate equivalent. So I'm going to finish at least my tour around the major habitats of Madagascar with the eastern rainforest portion. I've got to be aware of time so we don't run out because there's more photographs here, but the wet side of the island, some of which is very wet, and beautiful lush eastern rainforest. This is one of the few places where forest still comes all the way down to the ocean, up in the far northeast on Maswal Peninsula. One of the areas where orchids are particularly prevalent, lots of endemic orchids in Madagascar. This is one of the most celebrated species called Angraecum sesquipedale. When Charles Darwin was shown an example of this particular orchid, he predicted or said that he thought there would be a giant nocturnal hawk moth that had a tongue the equivalent length to these nectaries, which is the best part of 30 centimeters. He predicted there would be a moth with a tongue of similar length that would pollinate them. And at the time, people thought everyone else thought it was a ridiculous notion. 70 years later, after Darwin had made that prediction, they actually did discover the moth. And it's so named Xanthopane morgani predictor in honor of Darwin's prediction. Other wacky invertebrates, giraffe neck weevil, one of the most celebrated invertebrates on the eastern side of the island. This is one of the males that uses its long neck to joust with other males in battle to access females. And when they're breeding, the females then roll the leaf of a specific plant, host plant, into this amazing little parcel, into which they then lay a single egg. Some of the other spectacular invertebrates, insects you might see, this is the comet moth, the male comet moth, sometimes seen on the eastern side of the island. Of course, the wet side of the island is the area for frogs, virtually all of which are endemic, as I said earlier. This is one of the endemic tree frogs, belongs to a genus called Buphis. Most of these don't have common names, so I'm afraid I'm just going to have to revert to scientific names. One of the tree hole breeding frogs has a wonderful scientific name, the name of which escapes me, Plethodonta hyla notusticta. How about that for a scientific name? And ones that mimic moss, very difficult to find. This is one of the tree frogs that mimics moss. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, a tomato frog that is renowned from areas up in the northeast. Another good example of convergent evolution. This is one of the very brightly colored mantellas that produces toxic secretions. Nothing like as toxic as some of the poison dart frogs from Central or South America, but nonetheless, a really good example of convergent evolution because they're only rather distantly related. Reptiles too, as you might guess, are another specialty of the rainforest areas. This is one of the other boa species, the Malagasy tree boa. Another rainforest specialty, the rather remarkable spear-nosed snake, belongs to the genus Langaha. Very difficult to see. In all the time I've been to Madagascar, I've only found them on 2 or 3 occasions. Lots of chameleons too, of course, on the rainforest side. This is one of the most brightly colored, the panther chameleon, as you can see here, about to feed on this rather unfortunate praying mantis. One of the smaller but equally spectacular species, a lance-nosed chameleon that's found in Central Eastern areas. And the largest of the rainforest chameleons, Parsons chameleon, which is a real whopper. A big male like this can be 60 to 70 centimeters long from nose to tail tip. Primarily a canopy specialist, so often quite difficult to track down because they're high up in the trees. At the opposite end of the scale, smallest chameleons belong to a group called the Bruchesias, a genus called Bruchesia, which are largely forest floor leaf litter dwellers and are wonderfully camouflaged. These include some of the smallest of all chameleons and the smallest of all reptiles, indeed. The very smallest is found on an island off the northwest coast. This isn't quite the smallest species, but near as damn it is. And as you can see, relative to a matchstick, it gives you a realistic idea of the size. But if you had to pick a real winner for the ability to camouflage itself, it would undoubtedly go to another one of Madagascar's most celebrated inhabitants, the leaf-tailed gecko. This is a mossy leaf-tailed gecko lying flat against a tree trunk. If you haven't worked it out, the head's at the bottom, the tail's at the top, and you can see front legs just forming a shape towards the bottom of the tree trunk, and its spatula-like tail and back legs sticking out towards its rear at the top. And it has a wonderful frill around its edge, which blends its outline almost imperceptibly into tree bark, helps to prevent it throwing a shadow. The idea being that it then, of course, makes it very difficult for a predator to see. Some of the bird species that I'll come on to shortly are primary predators of this particular gecko. So this is undoubtedly, this level of camouflage has evolved as a means of reducing predation. There are lots of different varieties of leaf-tailed gecko, all belonging to the genus Europlatus. This is the largest of them, the giant leaf-tailed gecko, found in northeastern regions. Some of them, the first two that I've just shown you, mimic tree bark. Some of the smaller species mimic dead and shriveled leaves. This is the satanic leaf-tailed gecko, another wonderful scientific name, Europlatus fantasticus, that spends the daytime just sitting motionless amongst dry shriveled leaves in the understory and then becomes active at night. This particular species, the lined leaf-tailed gecko, specializes in mimicking palm fronds, so often is found in amongst palms, and similarly linear pandanus leaves, dry pandanus leaves. Keeping the camouflage theme, we'll introduce one of the endemic nightjars, one of the two endemic nightjars. This is collared nightjar that's restricted to eastern rainforest, here lying motionless during the day on a bed of pandanus leaves. And I mentioned some of the terrestrial kuas. This is one of the arboreal tree-dwelling kuas, the blue kua, which is a rainforest inhabitant. And this is one of the birds that specializes in trying to hunt the leaf-tailed gecko. So it will spend time just searching, sitting and walking around on branches, searching every branch to try and find a leaf-tailed gecko, not dissimilar in the way it behaves to African turacos. Back to the vangas, I mentioned perhaps the most celebrated of the bird families. This is, I think, the most spectacular of all of the vangas, the helmet vanga. As I alluded to, there are now 23 vanga species, helmet vangas being one of the largest. When I first visited Madagascar, this bird was thought to be a type of flycatcher, Ward's flycatcher. It's now known to be a type of vanga. DNA researchers managed to conclusively prove that it is more closely related to all the other vangas than any other bird, and they all share an evolutionary history. So many species that were previously thought to not belong to the vanga family now are included in the vanga family. I mentioned ground rollers earlier, the long-tailed ground roller down in the spiny forests. There are 4 species that occurred just in the rainforest regions. This is perhaps the most common, the pitta-like ground roller, so named because it resembles pittas that are primarily a Southeast Asian group of birds. At higher elevations in rainforest, often encountered or sometimes encountered is the rufous-headed ground roller. And then in lowland areas, 2 of the larger species, the scaly ground roller, and the largest of all is the short-legged ground roller. These are all birds that keen birders really spend time looking for. On the trips that I do, we certainly spend time looking for them because they're spectacular birds, but maybe not quite in the same, with the same level of intensity as specialist bird watching trips would. Rodents too, you would find or potentially find a huge variety of rodents in the rainforest, so they tend to be much harder to see because they're largely arboreal and quite cryptic. Tailed rats, this is the lesser tufted tailed rat, which you tend to encounter just in a sort of haphazard way. You'd see one scurrying along a branch. Occasionally they might freeze in a torch beam. More often than not, you'd just see a quick movement as they scurry along a branch. So not easy animals to track down, but once in a while you get lucky. Some of the more unusual ones, this is one of the hairy-tailed, white-tailed tree rats. This isn't one of my photographs. This is by a German photographer, Harold Schultz, that I've used recently in a book that I've done that I'll mention again later. But this is an animal that I've only seen a couple of times. So again, very specialist thing to see. Back to the tenrecs. This is one of the ones that's most easily seen, the lowland streaked tenrec. Another one that's relatively easy to see, the greater hedgehog tenrec, a bigger relative of the lesser hedgehog tenrec that I showed you from southwestern spiny forests. There are a whole manner of shrew tenrecs. This again is one of Harold Schultz's pictures that obviously outwardly resemble shrews, but a massive diversity of different shrew tenrecs. There are nearly 30 species belonging to two genera, Microgalia and I've forgotten the other genus there. Oh dear. Microgalia is the main genus of shrew tenrecs. Another one of the carnivores, perhaps the most easily seen of the endemic carnivores, the ring-tailed Vontsera. It's seen in many of the rainforest locations. This is the spotted Phaneluca. Again, relatively widely distributed, but not easy to see. Ranamathana National Park certainly used to be an area that it was easily seen, perhaps less so now. Some of the national parks, it's more difficult now to do nocturnal walks within the bounds of national parks. So some of these areas are a little more challenging to visit at night, but there are now private reserves on the edge of many of the parks in Madagascar where nocturnal walks are possible. So it is certainly possible you might encounter animals like this, but it's not as easy as it once was. This is an animal that's very difficult to see, the Phalanook, perhaps the most specialized of all of the carnivores in Madagascar. It's an earthworm specialist, so has very peculiar dentition that is has evolved to specialize in hunting earthworms and other invertebrates. The Fossa is the most widely distributed carnivore on the island, albeit difficult to see. Once in a while, you get lucky and encounter them in rainforests, where you can see here they're very, very agile, just like western dry forests. Same sort of behavior, mating trees during the Malagasy spring, our autumn, October, November. This is a large male that was climbing up a tree to access where a female was resting. Couple of shots from academic scientists that I know who've been kind enough to lend me these, that are taken with camera traps to show a female with two young kittens, not something that you would obviously see ordinarily. And here's a fabulously interesting shot taken on a camera trap from Mantadia National Park, which shows two males together. One bit of research that's only relatively recently come to light is that males from the same litter often stay together and form coalitions in a similar way to we know cheetahs do out on the African plains. But males from the same litter will stay together, and that allows them to hunt cooperatively and hunt more successfully, particularly hunt the larger lemur species like the sifakas. And males that remain in coalitions like this and specialize in hunting the larger lemurs actually grow to an average larger body size than ones that hunt singly. Interesting little aside. I mentioned the dwarf lemurs in dry forest areas. They also occur in the wetter forest areas, but are dormant for 5 or 6 months of the year. This is one of the more commonly seen species in areas, national parks like Andassi Bay, which is one of the most visited rainforest areas. This is Crossley's dwarf lemur, or the furry-eared dwarf lemur. However, this species also occurs in some very high elevation montane forests where it gets very, very cold. And therefore, in those cold locations, it's known to hibernate for 7, even 8 months of the year. And hibernate, would you believe, underground. They dig underground chambers, as you can see here. This is a shot by a researcher from Duke Primate Center, Dr. Marina Blanco, who's done a lot of work to further our knowledge on dwarf lemurs in particular. And she's made a number of remarkable discoveries to do with fur-eared dwarf lemurs and Sibley's dwarf lemur that's only found at higher elevations. And remarkably, they dig these underground chambers and become dormant and sleep in an underground chamber for 7 or 8 months of the year. One or two other nocturnal species. This is a sportive lemur on the Maswal Peninsula, a group that are widely distributed in the eastern rainforest and often seen on night walks. This is a most peculiar animal. I'm going to have to really hurry now because I know I'm going to run out of time. This is hairy-eared dwarf lemur that was thought to be virtually extinct until 20 years ago, until it was rediscovered in a number of areas. Number of species are active at night as well as during the day. Many of the day active species during full moon will become equally active at night. There are bamboo lemurs that are sort of Madagascar equivalents of giant pandas and feed exclusively on bamboo. This is the golden bamboo lemur. These are the feeding signs of the greater bamboo lemur, the largest of bamboo lemur species, which is able to crack open giant bamboo. One of the largest diurnal species that is often heard or can be heard but difficult to see, black and white ruffed lemur, often seen in zoos but much, much harder to see in the wild. And Handbook Mantadie National Park is a good place to see it. In the Maswal Peninsula in the far northeast, red ruffed lemurs are only found in that peninsula. So one of the specialized species that you would visit Maswal to see. Beautiful lemur, very vocal species, and one of the few primates that builds a daytime nest in which to give birth to its offspring. Lots of different siphakas in rainforest, down in Ranamafan in the southeast, Milne Edward sifaka, here with a youngster. In the central eastern forest, the beautiful diadem sifaka, I think arguably the most beautiful of all of the sifakas and lemurs. And in the far northeast in Mammals National Park, one of my favorite remote locations on the island, the very, very rare silky sifaka that I've spent many an hour trying to track down on the steep slopes of Mammals to get these photographs. The largest of all of the living lemurs, the Indri, relatively easy to see in Handbook Mantadie National Park, renowned for its haunting wailing song, has a large territory of roughly 40 hectares, leaps through the canopy with prodigious bounds of 10 to 12 meters, but is perhaps most famous for its haunting wailing cry that sounds not dissimilar to a humpback whale and can carry several kilometers through the canopy and is able to advertise the presence of each family group. I've alluded on a number of occasions to the fact that Madagascar has lots of environmental issues. Without doubt, it's an incredible place, but it also is a place that's under huge threat. There's probably less than 7 or 8% of original forest cover left. In its pristine state, Madagascar probably was 80 to 85% covered in forest, but now you can see from this very rough graphic how much of the native forest is left, and within the areas that are shaded here, they're by no means continuous, so there's far less forest left than this map actually shows. And you can see that deforestation is rife, particularly in the Central Highlands, but throughout the areas, all the areas of Madagascar. So you will see on any visit to Madagascar, large areas where deforestation has occurred, which is obviously very sad, but an awful lot of it is related to the local people who are very poor, simply cutting down forest as a means of survival. In the south and southwest, it's often to clear, not only to plant crops, but to produce charcoal, which is still primarily the main fuel for cooking. Other deforestation relates to illegal logging of tropical hardwoods, particularly rosewood, which is extracted in many of the northeastern areas was particularly rife during political unrest, but has largely been got under control now. But nonetheless, most deforestation occurs because it's local people simply cutting down areas to plant crops, hill rice or paddy rice. So it's subsistence agriculture, tavi agriculture that they're practicing. Rice is the staple carbohydrate in Madagascar. The original colonizing people probably came from Southeast Asia, so they brought with them a rice culture. So lots of areas in the Central Highlands, and particularly in the east where it's wet, are given over to rice paddies and rice cultivation. And rice is almost a religion in Madagascar. Per capita, the Malagasy eat more rice than anywhere else on the planet. But some wildlife is able to be used and harnessed in a way that's now beneficial. So in certain areas where large bat roosts are known, bat guano is being harvested to use as a fertilizer, for instance. And rather bizarrely, there are one or two areas where massive deforestation has occurred. This is in eastern rainforests, where whole hillsides have been cut down and over time have been replaced by the traveler's tree, Ravenala, that you can see growing here. Most of the time, this is obviously hugely detrimental to native species that are almost exclusively forest dependent. Once in a while, there's a native species that actually benefits. One of the few is this endemic bat, the sucker-footed bat. It's the only endemic bat family on the island, and it roosts in the curled up leaves of travelers' trees of Ravenala. So in areas where the Ravenalas have proliferated, these bat populations have done very, very well. This photograph is not one of mine. It's by a colleague who's got some beautiful pictures, a chap called Chien Lee, who's, I think, one of the best rainforest photographers on the planet. But of course, there has been, with this level of deforestation, the amount of human disturbance, there has been a lot of extinction that has taken place in Madagascar. We know of at least 17 species of giant lemur, some of which were the size of gorillas and orangutans, that are now extinct and are only known from subfossil remains like this skull in an underground cave. Celebrated examples of extinct species are things like the elephant bird, one of the largest bird to ever exist, several times larger than an ostrich, as you can see from this reconstruction and skeleton, and an elephant bird egg in comparison to an ostrich and a chicken egg, something like 160 times the volume of a chicken egg. Ecotourism is a hugely important component in the conservation effort within Madagascar, because the amount of money that comes in and is generated by ecotourism creates an awful lot of benefit. It's not all good. I mean, there are downsides to ecotourism, but all of the major conservation operations in Madagascar have ecotourism as a major component, and the benefit that and money coming into these areas shows that preserving the forest long term is much more sustainable and can provide an income for local people. I'm glad to say that since I first went to Madagascar in 1991, tourist facilities have improved. So most of the lodges around the parks in Madagascar are a reasonable quality. Some are more basic, some of the rainforest ones are more basic, and some of the ones on edges of forest, this is in Darena, are relatively basic, but provide a degree of comfort that's fine for a 2 or 3 night stay. So you might be sleeping on a mattress on a floor, but with mosquito nets and so forth, and there will be running water. But there's also some really beautiful upper end luxury accommodation available in and around some of the national parks. This is one of the more beautiful places on the north western coast called Anjijavi, which is a fantastic private reserve, wonderful lemur watching and bird watching and so forth, but obviously done at a very top end as well. So ecotourism is hugely important in Madagascar, and as I mentioned earlier, the experience of visiting forest in Madagascar, getting close to lemurs and other wildlife, is really second to none, because you're just able to interface with species that are found nowhere else on the planet and do it in a really intimate way. As I mentioned, there are downsides to tourism. Animals become too habituated at times. They'll come and scavenge around camps. This is in Karindi, where sometimes the Fusa comes to scavenge, and you get horrible scenes like Fusa scavenging on rubbish pits, which is not something we want to see, and is obviously a detrimental or downside to tourism. But the vast majority of instances, tourism is a good thing in Madagascar, and the benefits far outweigh the disadvantages. So this is another detrimental side to tourism that's only recently become apparent, that there are places where you can have sort of captive lemurs on your shoulder, something I would now encourage everyone to avoid at all costs, because posting pictures like this on Instagram has inadvertently led to a massive increase in the trade in capturing lemurs for the pet market within Madagascar. And obviously that's something we want to avoid. So if you are planning on visiting Madagascar, please, please, please avoid going to locations that offer this sort of thing. It needs to be wheedled out and stamped out at all costs. And the best sort of tourism is the stuff where you observe but are not directly involved. And you can observe at close quarters. This is obviously injury watching in Andasi Bay, but do so without any sort of detrimental effect. I've obviously had a love affair with Madagascar for the best part of 30 years. It's a place like nowhere else. This is me face to face with a Fusa. I'm going to unashamedly give you a plug now. My lockdown project for the last 2 years was to completely rewrite and do a new version of my book on the mammals of Madagascar, which has just been published. It was published in this country in January, and has just been published in the States as well. So if you are planning a visit to Madagascar, it's something you might want to check out. So just one final plug before I hand back to Ian. The next trip with available space that I'm doing to Madagascar is not for 2 years, I'm afraid, because the trips I've got this year and next year are already full. But if you are interested in one of my trips, then this is the next one that's going to be promoted. But as Ian said, there are going to be travel plans available for other trips, ones that I'm not involved with. But if you are wanting to go to Madagascar sooner, those may be ones you'd like to consider. So I've obviously talked at speed to finish it off. I will now hand back over out of breath to Ian.
Wow, thank you so much, Nick. That was sensational. It really showed the diversity Madagascar has, and why it, for any wildlife enthusiast, it really must be on the top of their wish list of places to go. So thank you very much. Just before
Not at all, pleasure.
Great stuff. Just before I launch our poll, I'll just introduce the 4 trips that we have on that. The first one is Nick's Island Apart, which for me, that really is the ultimate Madagascar experience. It takes in all of the key ecosystems, the most iconic species, and gets you well and truly off a beaten track as well. We also have a itinerary led by Mike Dilger, which follows the overland route down from the highlands, taking in the cloud forest of Ranamafana, and finishing in the spiny forests of Afati. And another itinerary called Madagascar's Rare Mammals, which focuses on the country's rarest mammal species. And lastly, a sample tailor-made itinerary called Madagascar's Lemurs, which takes in 3 of the most contrasting ecosystems: the otherworldly spiny forests of the south, the western dry deciduous forests of Karindi, and the rainforest of Andasi Bay. So I'll just launch that poll now.
Were there any questions that came in, Ian?
Yeah, so we've got some great ones. I think we are running slightly out of time, but I'll get started. We've got one from Kit Sheffield asking, how is most of the travel in Madagascar done? Mainly by air or by road? And what's the road journeys like?
Well, on a typical itinerary, it would be a combination. Most of the different locations are quite widely spaced apart, and the most efficient way to get around is to use domestic flights and then drive. So on any typical itinerary, you would probably have 2 or 3, maybe even 4 domestic flights, and then road journeys out to the various locations. In some places, you can combine different parks with overland travel because they occur relatively close together. So depending on the itinerary that you choose or is put together for you, it would be a combination of the two. A lot of road journeys in Madagascar do take time. There's no getting around the fact that travel in Madagascar is time consuming, and the roads are poor quality a lot of the time. And in combination with having to use flights, it's time consuming. So on the itineraries that I put together, I would rarely include more than 5 locations in a trip that's nearly 18 nights or something in Madagascar. And that guarantees that you would spend more time in locations than traveling between. And that, I think, is always something to look out for in any itinerary that you do in Madagascar. It's very easy to spend far too much time traveling and not enough time actually in the forests looking at what you've gone to see.
Great stuff. That's great. Thank you, Nick. Another one has come in as, where would you recommend for a second time visit to Madagascar? If someone has been to the slightly more popular reserves of Andasibe, Isalo and Zombitsi and Afati, where would you recommend they go next?
Okay, places to consider that outside those areas would be Karindi in the west, Ankarafansk in the northwest, or if you really want to treat yourself, Anjajavi, which largely has a similar cross-section of species to Ankarafansk. Ankarafansk is sometimes called Ampijaru. If you want something a little more adventurous, certainly the Maswal Peninsula is fantastic. And then there are several reserves up in the northeast and north that are worthy of consideration if you are fit and active. Marajeji, definitely, but you need to be pretty fit and active to do that. Or further north, Darena, and then into Ankarana and Montandombre. So all of those, you could combine the last 3, for instance, in one road trip and then fly back south. That's something that's a little loop that obviously or is part of some of the trips that I do. So those would be the ones that I would look to include on a second visit. You wouldn't include all of them, of course, but if you were to pick, let's say 3 of those, possibly 4, that would be able to be worked up into some sort of workable itinerary.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think we've got time for just one more quickly, which is, how did you get such great pictures of the eye at night?
Okay, well, those were all wild photos that I showed, all taken in Darena. Some with 1 flash, some with 2, and torches to illuminate the animal to allow you to focus. I have used video panels as well to help illuminate. But generally a flash gun that's off camera to try and reduce red eye, and where the animal is able to be relatively close, the flash gun may have a softbox on it as well. So a variety of different techniques. There's also inevitably quite a bit of work takes place after the picture's taken in Lightroom to lift up areas and make them look as they do when I show them. So they don't look quite like that straight out of camera, but that gives you an idea.
Great stuff. Thank you. I think we might be needing to move on to just announce when the next talk is going to be, which will be the Galapagos with Chris Breen on the 7th of March. And then we've got Nick and Alex talking about why choose a photo workshop on the 9th of March. I sorry I didn't get around to all the questions this evening, but if you do have any, please don't hesitate to get in touch and we'll happily answer anything in the coming days. Just to mention, we do have a special offer of £100 per person off any of those travel plans, which will be valid till the 10th of March, I believe. So yeah, I think we probably need to wrap it up there. Thank you very much all for joining us this evening. Hope you enjoyed.
Thank you, everyone.
And yeah, see you all soon. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.